Alright, y'all, so I finally finished The Fall of Cadia by Robert Rath, this 544-page tome. And honestly, after reading this, I kind of want to get into more Astra Militarum novels. This is such a good rendition of a classic Warhammer story. It had an amazing variable narrative lens and just fulfilled everything I needed and wanted to know about the Fall of Cadia. So let's break it down.
There is no peace amongst the stars, for in the grim, dark future, there is only war.
The fall and subsequent breaking of Cadia is one of the most pivotal moments in current Warhammer 40k lore. After 12 seemingly unsuccessful Black Crusades, ABADDON is back again to attack Cadia in the Cadian Gate. The Despoiler, son of the War Master Horus himself, has spent 10,000 years attacking seemingly random planets, and his so-called Crimson Path has led him, finally, to Cadia itself. This book starts out on Cadia amidst celebration. After weeks of what the Cadian defenders thought was the full 13th Black Crusade, they seem to have driven off the archenemy. But ABADDON at this point has been gathering the forces of chaos for hundreds if not thousands of years in preparation for this one crusade. This first attack on Cadia is nothing but a distraction, as the main force of chaos is on its way to Cadia. One of my favorite things about this book is how many characters it actually follows. Very reminiscent of The Gathering Storm Part 1, which is also titled The Fall of Cadia, this book follows several characters on both sides, and some characters who have no stake in this at all. On the Imperium side, we of course follow the main character of this conflict, Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed. Shadowed every step of the way by Color Sergeant Jaren Kell, Creed spends the entire book shoring up defenses, shoring up morale, and trying to figure out how to be the Lord Castellan. We follow 3 different Cadian soldiers, one in the Aeronautica, one an officer, and one a Kasrkin trooper. They provide us with 3 different scopes of the war and show us what Cadian soldiers faced on a daily basis. There's a criminal mob boss and trafficker of goods, Salvar Gint. Although he was raised on Cadia, he grew up to go against the system that he was brought into. But through excellent diplomacy on the behalf of Creed, Salvar Gint becomes a traitor-hunting asset. On the side of chaos, we have ABADDON the Despoiler, the War Master himself. He's surrounded by the minor players that are his chosen officers, and by a relatively new character, Dravura Morkath. She is a self-titled daughter of ABADDON and is used by the Black Legion in order to control the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity. Now, many of ABADDON's chosen officers are servants of the Chaos Gods. ABADDON has never chosen a Chaos God to give his fealty to. He sees it as a weakness that brought down the traitors and Horus the first time. But he keeps these worshippers of the Dark Gods on his council as a sign of their balanced interest in him. Chiefly among them is the leader of the Hounds of ABADDON, Arcanthos. A cornate worshipper of prodigious bloodlust, he tries to balance his loyalty to ABADDON against his need to be recognized by his god, Khorne. And then we have characters who show up on Cadia who are not necessarily there to defend the planet. Belisarius Cawl, who just figured out the reason for the first 12 Black Crusades, shows up on Cadia in order to study the Pylon network. Trazyn the Infinite, a Necron known for taking artifacts from important galactic events, is also there. Of course he's there to add to his collection, but he's also there to protect and monitor the Necron Pylon network, as he was one of the Necrons that was there when it was installed. Because of the great need of the Emperor's soldiers at this time, Saint Celestine shows up. Coming with a ship of battle sisters that had been lost in the warp, she shows up in the nick of time to help the defenders against the tide of Neverborn and Chaos's champions. The fighting across Cadia is at a scale that even few Cadians have ever seen. And this book does a great job at giving you the scale of the war. From the big fleet battles in the orbit of Cadia that ultimately failed, to the troopers at the end not trying to give a single inch of the dwindling Cadian front. Even with a planet and society that have been preparing for war for thousands of years and all of their allies, Cadia still falls. After the destruction of the Blackstone Fortress and being wounded by Celestine and her revived canonesses, ABADDON has to use his last contingency. If he wasn't able to go down to the planet and destroy the pylons one by one, he would destroy all of Cadia. The book ends as ABADDON sends the Blackstone Fortress crashing into the planet of Cadia, breaking it even as fighting still goes on. Cadia really did break before the guard, and I could not have thought of a better ending to this book. Let's talk about some of my favorite characters. I know this is going to be a cliche, very non-surprising answer, but Creed is definitely one of them. The Lord Castellan is a very different and interesting source of authority in this book, and he's very different from, say, the commanders of the Indomitus Crusade. He's not some highborn noble that always knew he was going to get this position. He came into being the Lord Castellan because the planetary governor of Cadia was assassinated. So a large part of the Creed character that we get in this book is about growth and about learning how to do this job. He has to balance the real material parts of being a military commander and being a figurehead, being someone that people look to for inspiration. And though Jaren Kell is definitely his own character, the Color Sergeant definitely does help Creed along his transition and is a large part of his character development. Another one of my favorites, this time on the side of Chaos, is Ercanthos. You get to see in real time as this 10,000-year-old world eater ascends to become a demon prince. Now, Ercanthos' story in the Fall of Cadia differs from the one in The Gathering Storm Part 1 in the fact that Ercanthos has some trouble in this book with his ascendancy. He really struggles with how to keep the attention of his god, and that conflict between his orders from ABADDON and his need to become a demon prince come into conflict a lot there. And then there were the three troopers that I mentioned before, and they are Marta Helsker, Cervantes Glaive, and Hannah Kestrel. Each one of them embodies the unexpected hero trope. Marta Helsker has to take over command of an incredibly important choke point after her commanding officer is killed. This is her first real battlefield command, and she has to hold this pass with 3,000 troopers against 10 times that number. Cervantes Glaive had to overcome a hand disability and not only exceeded his accomplished parents' expectations of him, but became an elite Kasserkin trooper. And then there was Hannah Kestrel, who had one of the most adventurous stories in the book. She was a recon pilot and was tasked with going out and surveilling the enemy positions. After getting evidence that the archenemy was there to destroy the pylons on Cadia, her plane is shot down. And she spends half of her story in enemy territory trying to find some allies to give this intel to. All three of these stories featured people that played very different roles from each other. Because of this, I didn't miss out on any level of the war. Now, I'm very excited to talk about what this book did well because it did a lot of things well. The number one thing is about who this book focused on. You might have noticed, so far I have not mentioned any Space Marine characters. Now, there were members of the Adeptus Astartes on Cadia. A contingent from the Space Wolves, a contingent from the Dark Angels, a cohort of Black Templars from the Cruxus Crusade. Even the Imperial Fists show up in the Phalanx to destroy the Blackstone Fortress. But the focus of this book, and the focus of what I think most Cadian stories should be, is about the Astra Militarum. And although the Adeptus Astartes played important roles in the victories and defeats of this war, the heavy lifting was done by the Guard. And I don't think a hard focus on the Adeptus Astartes even fits in with this type of story. Many Space Marine stories are essentially knightly quests where they face some impossible odds and overcome them, whereas Astra Militarum stories are more based in reality. They face impossible odds and they lose frequently. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely some interesting Space Marine stories in the book, particularly the Black Templars, but that seemed more like a treat, an addition rather than the main focus of the book. Another thing this book did really well is establishing and demonstrating the warrior society of Cadia. These people have been living on the most contested planet in the entire Imperium for thousands of years. Everything from the time that they are born is dictated by the military. Even if you are not a trooper or a soldier that's in the Cadian regiments and say you work in maintenance, you'll still have a rank. The picture books that they give to children have diagrams of gun parts and how to maintain them. Even your social status is dependent on how close to combat your unit is. It's an aspect of Cadian society that I think is developed a little bit better in this book than past Cadia stories. The last thing I think this book did really well was the messaging in it. And I mean that in a few ways. The first one being that this book really does address the propaganda machine of the Imperium. The right-hand man of the Lord Castellan, Color Sergeant Jaren Kell, is a master of propaganda, and that is a large part of his job. Also in this book, there are excerpts from a piece of literature written by General Reveiw, who was a part of the Cadian command structure during the Fall. They address a lot of the propaganda points that happened during this battle, and even kind of contradict some of the narrative that's being told outside of these excerpts. They mention lies directly told to the citizenry in order to placate them. They talk about how Creed was built up to be the mythic figure that everyone saw him as and was not really like that. Secondly, on the messaging front, you get to see what exterior conditions are necessary in order to create the best soldiers in the Imperium. Cadians have the reputation of being the most effective and efficient regiments in the Astra Militarum, and they are widely requested for wars throughout the Imperium. But what does it take to create a soldier that has such zeal and is so inimical to breaking and retreating? And the answer is a lot of really dehumanizing aspects of their culture. You are made to see yourself as an expendable piece of meat, something to be thrown at a problem until you or the people after you defeat it. All in all, the Cadian society and how they interact with each other is a masterpiece in world building. However, no book is flawless, and I had a couple of issues with this novel. I've read The Gathering Storm Part 1, The Fall of Cadia, so I know all the events that kind of happen within this battle. And maybe because I have these preconceived notions of what I think are the most important events, they didn't exactly line up with what was focused on in this book. For example, the coming of the Phalanx and the Imperial Fist and them breaking the Blackstone Fortress was kind of glossed over in here. Although I know the focus of the narrative is the Astra Militarum, that was a very pivotal moment of the battle. It not only prolonged Cadia's life for a few days, but it also set up the eventual destruction of the planet. So I thought it maybe deserved a little bit more narrative pieces in there. Next is my issue with Ercanthos, which I know I said he was one of my favorite characters, and he is, but there was a lot of time and effort spent on the development of his character and the examination of his story for him to ultimately end up dying. And I'm just not sure the trade-off of so much focus on him was worth maybe sacrificing other narrative pieces. But other than that, I really did not have any other issues with this book. So before we head out here, let's talk about some of the things that surprised me about this book, and they're all good things. First up is the character of Morcath. Morcath is a part of ABADDON's inner circle, and she is there because she can control the Blackstone Fortress. At first, we are operating under her assumption that ABADDON found her on the Blackstone Fortress when he conquered it. She sees him as a father figure, and he uses her talents as a telepath and as a controller of this fortress to his benefit. Her number one goal is to be recognized formally by him as his daughter. But later in the book, we learn that ABADDON actually created her. They had been using demons in order to control the Blackstone fortresses, but they were too unpredictable. So he created Morcath and manipulated her into caring for him so he had a more reliable aspect of control over the fortress. A very interesting character overall, and you're really able to see a different side of ABADDON through her. Another very positive surprise was getting to see Belisarius Cawl and Trazyn the Infinite work together. Robert Rath, the author of The Fall of Cadia, also wrote The Infinite and the Divine. So seeing his rendition of Trazyn again in this book was fantastic. The dialogue between two people who think they are the smartest beings in the galaxy is very funny. And that's tied to another thing that surprised me, which is the question, is Creed still alive? It's implied that Trazyn, who has been looking for something of this battle to take back to his collection, captures Creed and takes him back. At the end, everyone has already evacuated Cadia or died, and the only people who are left is the Lord Castellan and a small contingent of the Cadian Eighth. So I'm hoping that implication maybe has a reemergence somewhere else. Maybe it has a place in the new Ursula Creed story that's coming up. And the last surprise was this supplementary journal that came with the Mega Limited Edition. It's a journal that passes into the hands of several different Cadian troopers. Each of them fell to their end in a different way, but this journal was still passed on. There are some unexpected narrative bits in there that really delve into subjects like the Cadian family. I don't know if it'll be included in any of the paperback or hardback editions, but I hope so because it's a great piece of world building. I am super excited for you all to get your hands on this book, especially if you're a fan of any of the Cadia novels or stories that are out already. I think out of the three renditions, this, The Gathering Storm, and Cadia Stands, this is probably the best one. Cadia Stands is a great setup for the Minka-less stories, but this book is the story of the fall. I thought the book would be a little long at 544 pages, but honestly I could take another 100 pages and be okay with it. Thank you all for watching. Hit that like and subscribe button, comment what your favorite Cadia story is below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.